everybody in the world has to decide whether you stand on the side of the free world or you stand on the side of those who fight against the free world. And we are standing here on the side of the free world. This is a moment of truth.
Hello and welcome to another episode of This Time Tomorrow, the podcast that brings together democracy defenders in order to win out against autocracy. And this is Omri Preiss again, coming back at you for yet another monologue at the end of 2025 as we reflect a little bit about where we are, where we've been, where we're going. And just wanted to share some thoughts with you about what we're doing in terms of defending democracy and liberty and trying to mobilize people in order to do that. It sounds very grandiose, but that's kind of where we're at these days. And before we start, I just want to give yet another shout out to please follow, subscribe, wherever platform you find yourself on, whichever, I guess I should say. If you're on LinkedIn, go find us there, click follow This Time Tomorrow. If you're listening on Spotify, you should subscribe, follow, whatever it says. If you're on Apple Podcasts, do the same, but then maybe also leave a review because that helps the algorithm. And in the near future, you'll also be able to watch this on YouTube, I hope, and then you can subscribe there as well. And if you can think of just taking the link to the podcast and sending it across to WhatsApp groups, Signal groups, Telegram groups that you're a part of, that would be great. If you can think of just 2 people that you can send this podcast to, so you can share it. We're really trying to build up our audience base, and the reason for that is not that we love to hear our own voice that much. We kind of do a little bit, I guess, maybe, but much more importantly, we actually really do need a pro-democratic media ecosystem of channels and platforms and brands and, just content creation that is pro-democratic and organizes and mobilizes and calls people to action in the face of autocracy, because the autocrats, the extremists are doing this. They're doing this successfully. They have podcasts, they have YouTube channels, they have influencers, they have, TV stations, they have whatever media companies and marketing companies and so on, and oligarchs and big tech platforms, where we just need a voice to defend democracy. So with that in mind, please click follow, subscribe, find us wherever you can find us, and please click. Now, what are we going to talk about today? I mean, we're going to talk about how high the stakes are and putting that into context. Now, you may have heard a phrase thrown around quite a bit called the end of history and a holiday from history. It's often said that, when the Cold War was won by the West, by the so-called free world, and the Soviet Union collapsed, that, there was the end of history, the end of ideologies shaping history. This was a phrase famously coined by Francis Fukuyama, who then obviously lived to regret it, as that prediction and that prognosis unfortunately turned out to be false. And now with the return of war to the European continent, the war in Ukraine and so on, it's often being said that Europeans have experienced a holiday from history by basically not needing to invest in defense anymore, not needing to think about war as something that was close by to them, something that you maybe saw on the evening news happening at some faraway place that you can get worked up about or not care about. But it really wasn't, very close to them. And it's sort of Europe lived in this kind of environment where a kind of headspace where the only problems were sort of technocratic tweaking problems of a bit more of this, a bit less of that, job numbers here, growth numbers there. and no major colossal historic event was happening. This phrase, holiday from history, was coined to frame that idea, and the idea that now history is back. Europe needs to think about war and big power competition and geopolitics. The transatlantic alliance is not what it used to be. And all of that is true. I mean, the Europeans have, taken a holiday from history somewhere in the 90s, and now the history is back with a vengeance, perhaps. And what that means in terms of time scale and action and realistic action, timely action, all of that you can hear more about in the previous monologue about time that I did. And this monologue here, or this little segment you were listening to now, I want to talk about, well, yes, this return of history and a bit of historical context. So there is a time element here, but it's more of like a framing element. How do we frame the issue? And it is really my contention that while Europe has been on a bit of a holiday from history, the wider democratic world, the US included, and everywhere that's been a democracy, has taken a similar sort of a vacation from tyranny, if you will, or a time out from tyranny, if you're looking for the alliteration. Now, let's try and say that, time out from tyranny. Because if you look at this, idea of, we haven't had to deal with history for a while because everything was sort of fine and dandy, and we didn't have to think about like major cataclysmic geopolitical events like wars and revolutions and upheavals on the European continent. Likewise, in the free world, if you like, in this past decades, maybe a century, if you want to stretch it all the way back, you'll take it back to the French Revolution, the Enlightenment, the American Revolution. The advent of liberty and the progress of liberty is something that we've all really taken for granted. We've all taken for granted somehow that we have our rights, have our freedoms. We can go vote. We can, we're taxed. We pay money to the government. We receive services from the government. We can complain about those not being good enough. We can shout at our politicians to do a better job. We can then influence to some extent, maybe what our politicians do. And even if you're really pissed off that your politicians haven't done a good job and you've gone and voted for someone, like Trump, someone really annoying like Nigel Farage or Geert Wilders or Marine Le Pen or AFD or, Vox, any of these people, you're still saying, fuck the system. You're still kicking, kicking the foundations in a way of the system, and by you going out to vote, you're still making yourself heard. So even if you've been angry that the system isn't working, you're still taking the system for granted in many ways. People take for granted in Western societies and democratic societies that they have these rights, but in fact we've had these liberties for a very, very short time. Now, going back to the dawn of history, the agricultural revolution about 8, 10, 12,000 years ago, where groups of human beings decided that it was a good idea to settle down, set up agricultural societies, grow grain and raise livestock and so on in one place, and not be in a hunter-gatherer society. What happened very quickly is a division of labor, where men and women stopped being equal. I'm just paraphrasing some historical research. You can look it up and correct me on anything that I get wrong, but this is going to be very broad stroke kind of thing. So essentially, one of the early things that happen as societies settle down to living in one place and start doing agriculture is that the work distribution between the genders becomes much less equal, and also you have the emergence of kingdoms and priesthoods and religions, and people are not free in any sort of meaningful sense, but rather you do what the prophet said, what the priest said, what the king said, and then you get empires. So Sargon in ancient Mesopotamia, of Acadia, I believe. Again, correct me if I'm getting any of the names wrong. But Sargon is the first emperor of a Mesopotamian empire, where essentially you have totalitarian rule, right? You have the emergence of the idea that, some kind of divine force, a god or a pantheon of gods, put down this one individual emperor. Whatever he says goes, right? Like, there is no liberty. You are a subject in the empire, in the kingdom. The emperor is referred to in Mesopotamian traditions as the king of kings, and you are not free. You are a subject. And it doesn't matter, maybe you're an aristocrat, maybe, you're very high up and very well-to-do in your society, but you are not free. You're a servant of the king. Then, the Babylonians come along at some point. King Hammurabi, puts out a code of laws and says, well, maybe I'm the emperor, maybe I'm the king, maybe I say what's good and bad, and I'm gonna call it out as it happens. But here's a set of laws that we can all live by. So even though the justice is the king's justice, still, I'm going to let you know a bunch of laws, an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, all that kind of stuff. That's Mesopotamian justice that made it into the Old Testament. And, at least you know where you stand with me. You know which bit of you I'm going to cut off if you break the law, or, how I'm going to kill you if you commit a certain crime. So then you have the law, right? Then, you move a little bit further ahead into like Judaism, the advent of monotheism and of books like the Bible. And that what Judaism does that is interesting is it says basically, there is God above and then everyone else underneath. So you could be a king, you could be a prophet, or you could be a lowly prostitute, in the story on the fall of Jericho, for example. Or you could be, a barren mother, like in the story of Samuel. Or you could be King Saul, King David, King Solomon, King Omri, King Ahab, any of these kings. But God will judge you, and you will be judged. And so there is a space that the Old Testament opens up for liberation through subversion, right? Subverting power in some way. There is an angle to it that, because the Old Testament says that all human beings are created equally in the image of God. And throughout the stories of the Old Testament, different characters, have different roles, and God supports any of them, whether they're a prophet or a judge or a king or whatever. God switches sides quite a lot. And just because you're a king, it doesn't mean that you're always right. Even if you've been anointed by God, you could still be wrong. That Old Testament starts changing the story. Then you have Christianity and Islam, and in those traditions, then again, God appoints, most often, God appoints, the prophet, the king, the caliph, the emperor, with a right to rule, and everyone there is a subject. And in any of these cases, when you're born as one individual human being, you have your station in life, you have your role in society. You are a servant of your religion, of God, of the priesthood, of the king, and so on. And the idea of liberty is very far away. It's pretty much non-existent. And then, you have the Roman and Greek approach to this, where as a free citizen, you are free. Of course, that requires you to be a man, requires you to be a relatively local man, like you have to be a part of the polis. Later on in the 3rd century AD, for taxation reasons, all citizens, all free people or free men, we should say, of the Roman Empire become citizens, which is kind of where we have this this strong idea of citizenship that develops in Europe. But essentially, you are still a servant to the emperor. You're still, you're not free in the conventional sense as we see it. You're still bound by very, very strong codes of conduct, codes of honor, religious codes. Even in, Athenian democracy or in Roman democracy, first of all, it's very, very limited. It's a very small minority of people who are actually considered free citizens. And even then, as a free citizen, you're probably going to have to spend a significant amount of your time walking great distances and then whacking another man on the head with a sharp object in the name of imperial expansion. And you are constantly at risk of, being executed for some crime, or being sold into slavery, or just displeasing the emperor or whoever is above you in the hierarchy, and losing your head over that, or being forced to fall on your sword or something, or drink a cup of poison. So even Roman and Greek liberties were not that free. And then, you move forward in time, obviously you have the Magna Carta, which was essentially a rebellion by the aristocrats in England. This is around 1215, 1219. That time you have the top of the aristocracy telling King John, that's the evil king from Robin Hood, saying, hey man, you're overstepping. We don't like you anymore. Better sign this document that guarantees our rights. And that's basically the aristocracy revolting and saying, no. We, the top people in the country, the oligarchs, we have rights too. And that, sets out, a tradition of English freedoms. But again, that freedom is very, very much tied in with class. And if you're not an aristocrat, then, you're much less free in English society. There are other examples of liberties in medieval times, where you have the Republic of Venice, you have the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth with the Szlachta, so this kind of landed gentry that's also, they have certain rights and freedoms. Then obviously you have the Christian Reformation in the 1500s and 1600s, where a lot of religious liberties are guaranteed. Also, at the end of the 30-Year War, which killed a hell of a lot of people between 1618 and 1648, you have the birth of the nation state and what we call the international relations system of nation states in 1648 at the Peace of Westphalia, which also is designed to guarantee certain religious freedom and tell the Holy Roman Emperor, no, there are certain things you cannot do. You cannot enforce certain, religious diktats on people. And, people in different countries, in different states, have religious rights that the empire cannot overrule. That's one kind of freedom. Then in 1688, you have, again in England, the Glorious Revolution, where a Bill of Rights is introduced and certain liberties are afforded to certain kinds of people. Again, mostly landed gentry, people in aristocratic type positions, or, maybe expanding to the middle class. And there you have, the ideas of liberty that come from, first of all, you have Thomas Hobbes, which basically says, life is cruel and short, therefore we need to give political power to an authority, a king, like a Leviathan, which, is not an argument for democracy, but it's an argument that starts from the idea that you have one individual human being as a unit at the core of your political calculus. Your political equation starts with, the experience of one individual, which is something new, which is why it makes Hobbes a bit of a liberal, even though he might not have intended to be. Then you have someone like John Locke, who builds on that and says, well, actually, individual people have inalienable rights. They have certain rights that you cannot get rid of in natural law. And there you really get the ball rolling towards, the French Revolution, the rights of citizens, the idea of the United States as a place based on liberty. We believe these truths, to be self-evident. The Declaration of Independence, that all people are created equal, or all men, right? And this is still, it says men. So these ideas of universal freedoms are communicated in the late 1700s as being universal. But what it really means is white men of the right ethnicity and also who have a certain amount of money, right? So we've come from a time where, you were under the rule of an emperor, who's been appointed by God to cut your head off for whatever reason that they saw fit, or he saw fit most often, to a time where, there is a recognition that all men are created equal, but that doesn't apply to you because you don't have the money for it, or you're a different color, or, of course, if you're a woman, you still have a problem. So then, where you have voting that is limited across these different places that have the inklings of democracy, you have maybe, a few thousand people voting, you have maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, 10% of people voting. And, gradually the percentage, the proportion of people that are allowed to vote with these different revolutions and different bits of reform and legislation that happens, more and more people get to vote, until in the late 19th century, all men in places that are democratic, all men get to vote. So if you want to draw sort of an element of liberty that really starts emerging, separate from your income level, still doesn't apply to ethnicity and gender, but that really comes about in the late 19th century. So we're just over 100 years from that, so maybe 150 years or so, of that particular reform. Then we obviously have the world wars. We have First World War, meat grinder, Second World War, even a bigger one, even more horrendous. And in between those, you have women that receive the right to vote, and you have non-white people that get the right to vote. But if you look at actual economic liberties, equality before the law, being able to own property, being able to sign contracts on your own, being able to divorce, being able to take contraception and decide what to do with your body, it's only in the 1950s and 1960s that those things really happen for women. And it's only in the 1950s and 60s that we have, racial equality that is secured in the law, in the US for sure, but then also in democratic societies. So this is really within, a couple of generations. It's within lived experience. There are plenty of people around that were born in the 50s and in the 60s. This is really not far away. But if we look at liberty as we truly understand it, people who can really influence the direction of their lives, it's something that is very, very recent. In this kind of 10,000 year history of humanity, with all of these different examples maybe of freedom and democracy, whether it's ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the English traditions of freedoms, various Italian city-states and republics. It's only really in the last 50, 60 years, and if we want to be generous, then maybe 100 years, but that we really live in free societies where, more than half of the population is genuinely free. And it's very imperfect. We're very unequal. There are lots of problems in our political systems, but our freedom that we take for granted, is something that is very new. And it's not just, a kind of a boring civics lesson type of freedom. You get a right to choose and you get to vote, you get to It's also the idea that you're born and you grow up and you can build up your own future. You can decide what to do with your life. You can decide what job you want to go into, what kind of career you want to have, what kind of future you want for yourself or for a potential family. You can marry whoever you want. You can have whichever number of kids you want to have. You can vote for the politicians that represent you. You can go out on the street if you don't agree with what those politicians do. And you can participate in building a better life for yourself. And if you get taxed too much, you can demand that the politicians tax you less, or you can even move to a country where you might get taxed less, in Europe, I don't know, or anywhere else. So, I mean, these sort of very, very practical elements of freedom that really are part of our everyday life are really in danger of falling apart, right? So we've just sketched all of this out. Now, with the rise of global autocracy and authoritarians that want to take our freedom away, all of that is in jeopardy. And this is how high the stakes really are. Because if you let someone like Orban in Hungary, someone like Putin in Russia, someone like Trump in the US, someone, like Marine Le Pen in France, if she ever came to power, or Jordan Bardella, or, whatever the predecessors are, successors, apologies. Whoever the successors are, these people simply do not believe in a functioning democracy. They believe in basically a version of autocracy that they wrap up in all kinds of democratic populist language, because that's the thing that's worthwhile for them. And they come up with all these bullshit terms like illiberal democracy or guided democracy or controlled, whatever the fuck it is. It's just not democracy. It's someone deciding for you, and it's a small group of people who turn the state into a mafia, organized crime type operation where they make money out of it themselves. They weaponize it. They distract you with bullshit about, liberal elites and the deep state and immigration and foreigners and gay frogs and all kinds of conspiracies with whatever the fuck it is. They distract you from the fact that while they're spewing their hate, they're also turning the machine of the state into a corrupt moneymaker for them and for all their oligarchic friends. And the oligarchs have a great business model going where they support their people getting into power, and then they basically cash out in terms of buying up state assets for no money, getting crooked deals and tax cuts and gifts and whatever it is. And we should not pretend that this is not going to affect our own individual lives and freedoms and our own day-to-day experience in a very fundamental way. Now, in the US, there have been hundreds of thousands of people that have been detained in these sort of alligator Alcatraz type detention camps, basically a modern equivalent of a concentration camp. Obviously, they're not putting anyone into gas chambers at this point, but still, people are being deported into camps, and this has been in the hundreds of thousands, and they have a target of 1 million a year. This is actually happening. This is not a joke. It's not a fiction. It's not hyperbole. It's not an exaggeration. It's actually happened. And it's happened to normal people. Some of them are undocumented migrants, but some of them are also not undocumented migrants. Some of them are people who have been picked up by accident, and people who are American citizens or just, a Canadian entering the US. There have been random cases of people being picked up and sent into solitary confinement, being held in inhumane conditions. And if this doesn't ring enough of an alarm bell then I don't, I mean, this could be anyone. This could be any of us, any of these autocrats that support Trump and who Trump supports. Will do pretty much the same things as this. I mean, we have the template. We know what it looks like. We know what the bribery looks like. We know what the crackdown on civil liberties looks like. We know that this only accelerates. We have the template of Orban, of Erdogan, of Putin. We know what this collapse of freedom and democracy looks like. And if we let these people have their way, it's just going to end liberty as we know it. And this blip of the past 150 years of liberty, the past 100 years of liberty, the past maybe 50, 60, 70 years of freedom that we've had in a meaningful way in Europe will just become, just a timeout from tyranny, a holiday from history, a vacation from whatever, come up with the alliteration of your choice. But basically, freedom becomes a blip in the history of the world. And we go back to where humanity has been for most of the time that it's existed, in a agricultural, industrial kind of existence, which is under tyranny, living as serfs, as peasants, as slaves, as subjects, as servants of a certain kind of priest, a certain kind of emperor, a certain kind of king, a certain kind of tyrant. And this will just be a sort of turbocharged type of tyranny where we have AI, we have these massive game changers of technological tools that will just make the enslavement that much more effective and hard to break from, and hard to deal with. So, I mean, this is what is at stake, because a lot of the time, I think the main reason this kind of point really has to be made and highlighted and really underscored with vehemence, let's say, is that a lot of the time, people look at democracy and this whole conversation as being that is something that is relatively adjacent to their day-to-day lives, something that's, a little bit of an academic debate, maybe an activist thing. Maybe I can go over there and sort of have my career in tech and kind of, do marketing things, do my private business stuff or private sector stuff, or maybe I can, go and make the world better by, planting trees or dealing with malaria nets and mosquito nets or whatever. And this democracy stuff will kind of pass me by and sort itself out. But that's really not what's happening. Like the stakes are high for you personally, and it doesn't matter who you are. It's for anyone who's alive on the planet right now, whether you live in a democracy or not, but especially if you do. This will change your life. This will fundamentally transform how you experience life and how your family, your children, your close friends, what this will mean for you in terms of your economic well-being, in terms of your personal security, in terms of the choices that you can make or not make. And I think we had a guest, an interviewee earlier on this podcast, Nikola Ilic, who grew up in autocratic Serbia under Milosevic, and he said, the thing that you don't talk about much is just being around in a dictatorship sucks. It's a bad experience. People are worried about what they can say, what they cannot say, what they can complain about, what they can't. Who will inform the authorities? Will your neighbor tell on you? Will someone snitch? Can you actually think this, say this, do this? Who do you need to bribe to get ahead in life? What kind of connection to the government do you have? Do you know someone's cousin who can get you ahead in a kleptocracy, essentially? And that sucks. It's a shitty experience. It's a shitty experience on a political level, on a psychological level, economically. For your life, it's shitty. You do not want to be there, and you definitely do not want to be in a dictatorship that is turbocharged with AI and all of these very advanced technologies that are, if they're not being used to serve us and make our lives better, they will be used to subjugate us and turn us into drone slaves. So this is really what's at stake. This is the whole point of this ramble, of this monologue here, is to underscore that, we do not want to have our freedom turn into just a blip in history, a timeout from tyranny. And for that, we really need to get involved. We need to take this seriously. And this is what this podcast is all about. It's about what we do to be free this time tomorrow. So thank you very much. Thank you for bearing with. Once again, please subscribe, please follow, click subscribe and follow on Spotify, leave a comment or a review on Apple Podcasts, find us on LinkedIn and follow there, send a link of this podcast to a Telegram group or a WhatsApp group or a Signal group or a Facebook group. Choose 2 people that you know and send this podcast to them and tell them, please listen. And, even if you did not enjoy this episode, do that anyway, because it's the point that counts. It's the principle that matters. So thank you very much. And please give us your feedback on whether you think these are good, these monologues, and whether they should be longer, shorter, faster, slower, anything else. And take care. Bye-bye.